All right, I say we do this thing. I say we jump in. Let's talk about it. Talk about what Lumen 2.0 is. This is the second part of... I have no idea how many streams I'm going to do that is designing Lumen 2.0. We talked about like high concepts, and we got through a decent amount of the character concept last time we met. And so how the format that we've been following, if you didn't see the last stream, is basically I've got Lumen here, and I've been sort of going through what Lumen 1 had, and then deciding what stays, what goes, what needs to be changed, or what's good as is in the existing framework of the game. So we kind of went through attributes, reframing them as approaches. We went through classes, kind of more so like not classes, but like what a character is. And they're all about approaches. We've removed health as a thing that characters have, and that's going to be a big part of the discussion today about combat and enemies and what that looks like if one side of the table doesn't have health. Should the other side have health? If not, what does that look like? We're gonna have that discussion today. Got rid of the resource, and I've been kind of thinking about this. I've been playing Nova with some friends the last couple of weeks, and we had a session just the other night, and one of them was getting very close to having no fuel left, and they were going to have to start getting to the point where they were going to be doing things during their turn that weren't powers, but also then as a result weren't going to be what they wanted to do. And so for me, it kind of reinforced the idea of not having the spendable resource thing. As we kind of talked about, it was either useless or not fun to track. Powers, we've sort of stepped away from the idea of powers as something that is purely defined as like a suite of like abilities that you have. And I don't know, now it's just like stuff. Now you just have stuff. Equipment, powers, mods, all sorts of weird things are made up of that, and they're sort of limited by whatever we're going to reframe the resource as. And that got us through a character for the most part. Which gets into like character creation, and I don't really want to worry about character creation right now. What I want to kind of talk about today is combat. I think today we got to have like the weird conversation about combat. So, Lumen is a combat game. Or system. Lumen 2.0 continues to be a system about fighting things. Its original inspiration was... what a fun song. Its original inspiration was video games. Which this music that we're listening to right now reminds me of. Characters that are very powerful. They have a handful of abilities, right? Like an ability mapped to like a couple of buttons on your controller. And you would just kind of do the cool thing over and over and over again. And that core premise isn't going away, but how combat is done is probably changing a bit. So, like, what are the big elements of combat that we need to figure out? Right, and we can look at Lumen 1.0 as a reference, but, like, we need to figure out concepts of, like, rounds and order and all that, right? So, are there specific rounds where people have turns, and then, action economy then related to that? Health and enemies Do they have it? And then also enemy actions. And then the other really big thing that we need to talk about is, what does the fight look like? Meaning a grid versus theater of the mind. Which I think it will be a bigger conversation. All right. Just looking at Lumen, right? What did the combat section of Lumen talk about? It talked about rounds and turns. I still think that's absolutely the case. I think we're still doing players have turns. I like the idea of players have turns. The GM has their turn at the end still. It feels very video gamey to me, and I like that. I think it's interesting. There's obviously some changes from what Lumen 1.0 had with, like, rolling, because we're not going to be rolling anymore. And we have to talk about drops. Yeah, talk about the GM turn and drops. And then the whole range thing then gets into the idea of what does the combat actually look like. And then we can get into enemies. This is going to be the hardest thing for me to figure out, I think. Because I'm currently working on a number of games that I would say are all Lumen 2.0 games, but very pretty differently in terms of how combat works. In that, like, for example, Hunt, which I don't have a copy of handy. Hunt was the first Lumen 2.0 game. Before Lumen 2 was even a thing, Hunt was made, and it shows what I wanted to do with the approaches. It shows what I liked about powers, and it had a grid combat thing. You used a grid combat to track the movement of the knights as they fought the beast. And that's good, because that fits the vibe of, like, you're not really fighting a lot of things in Hunt other than the one fight, so you're not, like, setting up a lot of stuff. But then I'm also playing, like I said, I've been playing a lot of Nova, and Nova is all theater of the mind, right? It is zones, essentially, right? It's bands of ranges, things that are close, near, or far. So it's like zones and paths, so not as cleanly defined as we've seen in other people's games. So I want to kind of talk about, I want to start by talking about grid versus theater of the mind. And what's good and bad about both of them. And then ultimately come into a conversation of, like, do we have to choose one? Because I don't know if we have to choose one in defining what Lumen is. But I think if we just leave it very open, like, obviously that doesn't help with a system. If it's like, I don't know, you figure it out, like, too much, then there's no real guidance. So, you know, let's kind of talk about this. So let's talk about the grid first. Pros, cons, grid versus theater of the mind. Grid is nice because it's like, it's super easy to track what is going on, right? It's so easy to track what's going on because you know where everybody is, exactly where they are. You know specific distances, right? Allows for more flexibility of powers and weapons and all that in terms of how they are defined. That might feel weird to say that a grid provides more flexibility, but it does, right? Like, if we have a 6x6 grid that we're fighting on, you can have a power that works at range 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, right? Or you can have powers that are hit everyone between 2 and 3 spaces away. There's a lot of options there. If you only have close, near, and far, or whatever equivalent to what it's saying in range, like range bands, you don't have a lot of options, right? It's always like, it's everybody who's close or somebody who's near. Which in terms of flexibility of design of weapons and powers and stuff like that is narrow. So that's what I mean by more flexibility in terms of what the grid affords us. I truly think the biggest and most important thing about the grid is that it is easy to track things on. It also allows for more concrete like direction of the battlefield, I'll say. What I mean by that is, like, you can clearly place terrain types or traps or things that have mechanical purposes much more easily on a grid than you can in a Theater of the Mind thing, right? It's hard enough in Theater of the Mind to track where you are versus where all the other characters are. It then becomes even harder to track the things that are not the characters. Like things in the terrain, like a weird trap that somebody laid down. You're gonna forget where that is because you're tracking where you are, where your allies are. You're trying to track where enemies are, and again, it's not that that stuff is impossible to do in Theater of the Mind. It's just more difficult. In terms of cons of this sort of thing, it does require some sort of material. Even if it is digital, it does require having a grid handy, having tokens and markers and things like that. You need a grid, you need tokens, markers, things like that to track things. So it's asking something to be used. The advantage of Theater of the Mind is that you don't need anything, right? It's all inside your head. So you don't need little miniatures or little tokens to be like, okay, this little red die represents the enemy. I'm going to put it on this space, right? That's a con. It is slower to set up simply because it needs to be set up. You do technically set up a fight in a Theater of the Mind thing by describing the environment, but you do that anyway when you're setting up a grid fight too. And so it's not as if Theater of the Mind gets away with, like, you don't set anything up. You do. It's just you set up, that part of setup is also an inherent part of grid combat. But grid combat then also requires the GM to quickly sketch out what this fight looks like, have it pre-made or something like that, and that takes time, right? Theater of the Mind, you just jump right into it. You're in it right away after the scene is set. So that's the thing to consider. And then one thing that this is just a belief that I have, is that this stifles creativity in combat to a degree. What do I mean by this stifles creativity in combat? When you give somebody a concrete representation of something, they have a difficult time interpreting the idea or how to use that thing beyond its typical use. We call this like it's the idea of functional fixedness, essentially. Functional fixedness, which is once you know how to use something or see something used one way, essentially, it's very hard for you to think of alternative ways to use that thing. So once the scene is set in a grid and the GM has marked whatever they think is most important in terms of terrain features and things like that, that's the stuff you're going to interact with as a player. And you're going to go, well, on my turn, I'm just looking at what is on the board, and looking beyond the board is cognitively more difficult to do. as opposed to a theater of the mind scenario where the map is not clear in anybody's head. But as a result of that, you have more power actually to act creatively in that environment. You have the ability then to insert things into the world. You can ask, hey, is this here or something like this here? And the GM might not have considered that thing to be a part of the fight before, but now it is because you've asked. And you can technically ask with a grid, it's just we struggle to do that compared to when things are open to interpretation. So there's a restricted range of creativity, I think, to a certain degree when you talk about grid combat. So then let's talk about theater of the mind. Pros and cons. Pros and cons of theater of the mind. Oftentimes when we do a pros and cons list, we just look at the cons and make them into pros, and look at the pros and make them into cons, right? That's the easiest way to kind of think these things out as we compare the two. So what are the cons of grid combat and how are they pros in theater? No materials, right? Or very few if we want to draw a representation. Very quick to set up. Super quick to set up. Inspires creativity in combat. Allows players to like involve themselves in the space, to inject their own ideas into the space. I'm gonna say this, and I'm not sure if I fully buy it or not, but my gut is that, like, just generally, this feels less crunchy to me, and I don't know if that's entirely true. I'm just writing it for now to chew on it, because I've had this struggle in games that have theater of the mind combat. I really struggle with combat empowered by the apocalypse games. It's a personal thing for me. I really struggle with it. I know there are other people out there who are great at it. My friend, Brandon Leon Gambetta, is really good at, like, masks and PBTA games. And he gets it, and I just don't. And I would say that PBTA games are oftentimes thought as less crunchy than something that's, like, got a bunch of rules and feats and stuff like that, like 5th edition D&D. Well, this is a wild song. I don't know. I don't know where I'm kind of going with this less crunchy thing, because I don't know if I fully believe that. I'm going to put a question mark there. Cons. Cons of theater of the mind. It's difficult to track where things are and what's going on. Lots of questions. That's the biggest con. That's the biggest and most obvious con of theater of the mind combat is I don't know where I am. I don't know where everything is. And as a result, similar to this, it is difficult to represent the fight in a visual manner that people can look at. It's not impossible. A good example is zones and paths. A bad example are those concentric, how the hell do you spell this? Concentric circles that people talk about. Let's talk about the bad example. I've seen lots of people try to use radiating circles, right? Concentric circles, meaning like there's a circle in the middle that's close, there's a circle outside that's near, and then there's a circle out the furthest one that's far, and you put enemies in those various circles to show how far they are from the group. The problem with those is that it assumes that the entire party is at the same location the entire time. Right? if you're going to use relative positioning, which is what these range bands are, you have to think about it in terms of relative positioning. The party's not all going to be next to each other. So while some enemy might be close to me, they might be near from another ally of mine if we're not standing next to each other. And those circles then become impossible to track where enemies are in any realistic way, unless each player has their own and is updating it for each individual enemy, which sounds like a nightmare, right? Those circles fail. They're not correct in terms of understanding how range works. But I have seen things like zones and paths, which do a really good job. I saw this in Binary Stars game, which the name is escaping me, and it really bothers me that I can't remember the name of it. I want to say Valiant Horizon. I'm sorry, Binary, if I can't remember the game off the top of my head. But he had drawn, like, he had a great example of how to represent zones and paths, right? Basically, what you do in a fight is you draw a couple of circles of, like, the major locations in the fight. Like, let's say the fight is taking place in, like, a warehouse in Nova, and there's a battle taking place, right? You might draw a circle in, like, the main area. There's a circle up here for this platform. There's a circle over here for this, like, control panel. There's a circle over here for this door entrance, right? And then you draw paths that connect them. And anybody who is within the same circle is close. Anybody who is one drawn path away is considered near. And then anybody who's two paths away is considered far. It's really smart. So you can do it. It's not that it's impossible. It's just, it then requires drawing something out. And at that point, haven't we already established that the grid lets us do that really clearly? Something to think about. In terms of other cons, let's look at the pros of the grid. Flexibility of combat. This is, you know, it's a restricted range. Restricted range of powers to a certain degree. Right? I can only say that something is close, near, or far in terms of, like, what a power affects. You give somebody a grid, not only do they have the, like, the range things that we said, like, you could be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces away to do this thing, but also you could do things like affects everything in a straight line of 3 squares. Right? That's kind of cool. That's tactical. That's fun to think about. Like, ooh, I hit everything that's in a radiating diagonal line from me. That's a fun power to be able to build. And you really can't represent that in a theater of the mind situation. It's very hard to try and think about things that way, right? So, you know, that's just something for us to think about as we're going through this. And then the other pro was what? More concrete direction to the battlefield? Yeah. Terrain types and things like that. It's harder to track the things that aren't characters in theater of the mind. It's super, super hard. It's not impossible, but for the games that we're talking about with Lumen, which are oftentimes not like 2 characters versus 3 characters or something like that. It's like, it's the 3 PCs versus 20 enemies. Because in Nova, you wipe out waves of enemies. At least in Nova 1. That if you're already trying to track a million different enemies, then on top of that, you're like, and now track where that Corvus just laid down, like, a shrapnel grenade. You're like, I don't have time to track that and all this other stuff. It's hard. So the question then becomes, which one are we going to do? Because, well, this is where I'm going back and forth on, like, the grid versus theater of the mind and everything like that is, first of all, do we have to decide one, right? Like, that's part of the conversation. Do we need to pick one of these to be the default for Lumen 2.0? You can make the argument no, right? You could argue no. and say, use the setup that makes sense for you. But that leaves so much of the book then that needs to be reinterpreted to fit that type of game, right? I know we didn't really define all of this stuff up ahead or above with like the powers, but like a character isn't just powers, their equipment, their abilities, things like that. And we would have to effectively write this section, whatever it ultimately becomes, twice. Once for what does a character look like if you're using a game that has a grid, and again, what does a character look like if you're using Theater of the Mind? I don't really feel like writing that twice. I don't think that helps. I think the system should be focused. So I am going to argue, yes, the system should be focused. It should have a general, I don't know, mission statement that is what it needs or what it's trying to accomplish in designing with it, right? Leaving too much of you figure out how you want to do it and make it how you want. At that point, like, I'm not helping you anymore. At that point, I'm just saying, go design a game. And that doesn't help anybody. And the goal of a creator kit is to help somebody design something. It's not necessarily to tell them exactly how to design something, but it's supposed to help. And I feel like if I do both, that doesn't help. So, what do I decide? What do I decide on this? Any guesses? Any guesses as to what I'm gonna go with here? Theater of the Mind or Grid? The first Lumen 2.0 game had a grid for Hunt. Nova, probably my favorite Lumen game, uses Theater of the Mind. Of the Lumen 2.0 games that I'm working on, one has a grid and one doesn't. I'm going to say Theater of the Mind. Theater of the Mind is my gut right now. With the important emphasis on zones and paths to address the weaknesses of just plain old Theater of the Mind with range bands, which was a fine start, but ultimately becomes very difficult to track. This keeps things open for, I don't know, the second I've said this, now I'm immediately regretting it, right? Because I'm imagining designing Nova 2 and giving it like a really cool grid that the sparks like have powers that affect certain like spaces on the grid. Sounds fun to me. I like tactical games. I like them quite a bit. This is the thing that's gonna destroy the ability to make Lumen 2.0 into anything, is that I can't decide this. I have to write my notes to myself. Even stream of consciousness design is how I do it. So like, literally, stopped writing the sentence above because I was filled with regret about abandoning the grid, and how grid tactical combat is very fun to me and could be super sweet with Nova 2. Ah, this is the most frustrating part of this entire thing. This is gonna be the thing that kills me. You gotta check something real quick. What was that? Oh. Do you see my problem? Do you see the dilemma that I'm in right now? And the problem also is not solved by the fact that I am designing games in Lumen 2.0 that are both with a grid and without a grid. And I consider them all to be Lumen 2.0 games. So maybe it is okay to say that you can do either one, and we just have to address that in the SRD. Or not the SRD, the creator kit. That's frustrating. That's frustrating. Coming back to this. I don't think I can choose. Literally incapable. Literally can't do it. Alright. Let's put a pin in the grid versus the theater of the mind thing for now. What about all this other stuff? Rounds, action economy, GM turn drops, all that stuff. That stuff I think we can iron out pretty easily because I don't think a lot of it is going to necessarily change. Alright. Rounds and turns. GM turn. I don't see any reason to change this. This works exactly as I intended it to. You know, the basic structure of PCs all take a turn, whatever order they want. Then the GM gets to go. Works great. You know, does it always work that way? No. Because like in Hunt, for example, the beast acts between each knight's turn. It's not all knight, beast, knight, beast. It's knight, beast, knight, beast, over and over and over again. Oh, chair just exploded. So I think it, I think it largely works as is. It's not a bad idea to talk about doing a back and forth PC and GM approach, depending on the goals of the game. For example, Hunt is just one fight, and it's one enemy versus the knights, right? So if I just sit there and you only have one fight in Hunt, and it's 4 knights that are playing, and they all get to take a turn before the beast goes, they're gonna alpha strike the beast, and the fight's gonna be over, right? Unless I bloat the health of the beast so that they have to go through a bunch of rounds anyways, which I don't want to do. I potentially want to remove health entirely from enemies. So, I think that the back and forth really only works if you are doing something like a single fight or like a single big enemy versus the PCs. Otherwise, I think it works as is. The GM turn stays as is. Activate enemies, some number determined by the game, right? So like some are like activate a number of enemies equal to the PCs, or activate a number of enemies equal to PCs plus 2. It fluctuates depending on how difficult you want the game to be. And then I don't know, shift and drops. So let's talk about the shift, and then let's talk about GM drops. The shift is the twist in the fight that the GM brings in. I love this, and it's staying. I just, in my own games, need to give more overt advice on how to do this. I don't like being very prescriptive in a lot of my games. Like, there's a lot of things that I want you to make a decision on your own about what you're going to do. And a lot of people struggle with that. And I think there are some instances where that struggle totally makes sense and it's something that I can iron out. And others where it's like, I don't know what to tell you. I think you just need to figure this out. The shift is one of those things where I can't tell you what you should do. Like, I can't tell you, like, here's a list of 5 shifts, use these 5 things every single time. Because the fight that you are in every single time is going to be different. I don't know the environment that you've set up. I don't know a million other factors. You need to, as a GM, be creative and come up with something. That said, I think I could still be more overt in my own games about how to put together some ideas or, you know, providing shift examples for specific enemy factions if your game has a bunch of different enemy factions or something like that. I'm working on Blight right now, and the shift for the Sparks, when the Spark takes its turn, Sparks are the bad guys, by the way, will be dependent on, you know, there will be some that are suggested for each Spark so that you can do something that kind of feels in line with that Spark. So that stays. But what about drops? If we've removed health and a spendable resource from the PC, what would the drop be? Right? Drops were this thing that I added, which is an incredibly video gamey thing, where you kill enemies and they literally drop blobs of health or fuel or whatever that you hoover up as the characters, and they're yours. And that's how the players always kind of stay topped out or not like close to death, is that they're recovering a lot through killing enemies. Such a video game type thing, right? Wipe out a wave of enemies and they drop an ammo brick that you can pick up, and now you've got special ammo again. Or whatever, right? So before we even consider like what a drop would be, one of the issues, one of my issues with drops was that they are really slow. In a combat system that is about fast turns, the drop point of the round was agonizing to play. And your experience might vary, but for me, playing things like Nova, right? The players would have wiped out, let's say they wiped out 5 enemies in a round. It's a totally normal thing. 5 enemies. The GM rolls 5 dice, and X number of things are going to be made. X number of drops. And let's assume 4 out of those 5 turn into something either being health or fuel. As is written, anybody can pick that stuff up, and the players decide in that moment how they want to split it up, which suddenly just slams the brakes down on the fight, where it's now, okay, let's stop. Everybody tell everybody what your current health and fuel is and decide what makes the most sense for who to pick up what. It's like, I understand my intention for why I designed it, but it's like, after seeing it, like, you know, in action after a while, it's slow. It's way too slow for what I want the game to be. So what do you do about something that just completely slows down what should be fast combat? Well, we could just get rid of it, right? We could just get rid of it. If we look at the first point here, it sounds like we don't even necessarily need it. Because the PCs don't have health. They don't have a spendable resource. What could be dropped? There is something that could be dropped, right? Because what is health in Lumen 2.0? It's not an arbitrary hit point. It is the approaches, right? The health is now the approaches themselves. And the approaches get knocked down in their max value when you get hit. So what are the drops? The drops are ways of regaining your approaches, right? It is a way to recover your approaches, both uses and max, right? So enemies could drop uses. It's already a weird thing to say that somebody like hoovers up health out of a dead enemy, so I don't care if we're now also saying you hoover up a use of sun or moon or shade in Nova from this enemy. I don't care about that. It's video game logic. It's role-playing logic. The sun exploded in this game. Nothing makes sense. So you could either just be recovering the uses of those approaches, or it's a way of recovering your max, right? And that's effectively then recovering health. So in a round, the enemies might hit you and knock down your sun 2. And so you went from 3 max sun to 1. You're getting close to having no sun left. But you kill an enemy and they drop sun. And now you're back up to 2. Right? Your max has been increased to 2. Your temporary max. I guess we should be talking about it as temporary max, but so that's what a drop would be. So again, let's go back to the speed thing. If drops, one of the issues is that it's a speed thing, and one of the solutions is to get rid of it. Yeah, we can do that. But if we like drops as something that can help us with the approach game and the back and forth between spends and maxes of approach and recovering them and everything like that, then we still need to keep it, or we want to keep it, but we want to keep it in a way that's improved. So assuming we want to keep drops, what should they look like? Well, we need to get rid of the roll in the first place, right? Drops are generated by a roll in Lumen games, in most of them. So, like, for example, in Nova, an enemy dies, you roll a d6 for each one of them, and the value of that die tells you whether or not they dropped nothing, health, or fuel. And you have different values for those things. Why are we getting rid of the roll? Because there's no dice in Lumen 2.0. So I'm not going to randomly bring dice back just for drops. So they got to go. The dice rolling, at least. So we got to get rid of that. Nobody has dice. So the GM doesn't need them. So what should it look like? Well, then if it's not randomly determined anymore, then that means there are guaranteed drops from certain enemies, right? Certain enemies just drop things every time, guaranteed, and that means other enemies don't. Not everyone does. Most goons probably don't drop anything. You need to kill something a bit more powerful or of significance. Right? So if you're fighting a group of goblins, and there's like 4 goblins and then 1 goblin like boss running them all, the regular goblins might not drop anything, but killing the boss drops something. So that's part of it, right? We guarantee a certain drop. You know, we could offer choice a la Reap. So in Reap, which is not a Lumen game, but like you can take body parts, essentially blood, bone, and body from enemies that you kill and use them to enhance your spells. And some enemies, it always gives you bone when you kill this enemy. But some are like, this enemy you killed, you can choose, do you want body or blood? You choose. So we could offer choice. And then I think the other thing is we remove the discussion phase of drops. How? Drops don't have their own phase during the GM turn. They happen immediately after killing an enemy. And the killer gets the drop. End of story. That's it. Right? And if they don't need it, oh well. Like, I don't want it to be, all right, if they don't need it, it stays on the battlefield. Oh, geez. It stays on the battlefield and somebody else can pick it up, because that's one more thing that we're trying to track. One more thing. If we're doing Theater of the Mind, that's one more thing that's inside our head that we're trying to keep track of. Trying to reduce cognitive load. So there's no GM turn drop phase. The GM turn is just activating enemies and doing the shift. The drops happen when you kill an enemy. You kill an enemy, I, as the GM, will go, oh, you just killed a goblin boss. You can recover a point of force if you want. And if the person goes, great, awesome, I need it, then they take it. And if they don't, they go, oh, okay, oh well, I don't need it. And then that's it. And the drop expires. Now there's no longer one more thing that the GM has to do during their turn. It keeps the flow going. There's no sudden discussion of, all right, who needs this right now? Everybody shout out what your current max values of these things are, or your uses of all of them, because that slows it all down. We're getting rid of all that. So coming up here, this, good, you know, this isn't changing. This is the same. Characters will have X number of actions they can take, define the actions, move, power, weapon, etc. The other thing that we haven't talked about are enemies and enemy health and what that looks like. And I think that's a much bigger conversation than what we have time for right now. Because I have again 2 tracks in my head, much like the Grid versus Theater of the Mind, that I can see this going, and they're pretty different from each other. So I'm gonna leave a note to myself here, which is the next thing to talk about is enemies in combat, and the tags versus the health approach, and which one we're going to talk about. Because I've been going back and forth in my head about this one too. And it's a long, we're almost an hour in right now, and it's a longer conversation. So I think this wraps up part 2. Part 2, we got a general sense of talking about the Grid and Theater of the Mind. We didn't solve anything, but we talked about it. We updated kind of the sense of what the GM turn is, with the shift just sort of being clarified, and drops being much cleaner and faster with this current iteration. So yeah, that is going to wrap up part 2 of our chat on what is Lumen 2.0, which means next time we're going to dive into enemies, and we're going to talk about how Dusk does it, how Hunt does it, and how those 2 different design types inform different things, and which one I like more. So we will do that next time. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. I'll talk to you later. Bye.